Hello guys, and welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we will gently explore a rather dark and fascinating topic: why it truly sucked to be a medieval executioner. This will be a slow, soft-spoken journey into the past, designed to help you relax and perhaps even drift off to sleep as we learn about this harsh job in a calm and neutral way. So, get comfortable in your bed, take a deep breath, and close your eyes if you like. Imagine yourself in another time, far away, where lanterns glow on old wooden beams and the world moves at a quiet, ancient pace. Before we begin our story, I'll gently remind you to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these long, peaceful history narrations. Your support helps me continue creating these restful journeys through time for you. Now, let's travel back many centuries to the medieval world. It's a cool, misty morning in a small medieval town. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting a pale grey light over the stone walls and thatched roofs. You find yourself standing at the edge of a silent town square. The air is crisp, and you can hear distant birdsong mixed with the soft shuffle of a few early risers preparing for the day. In the center of the square stands a wooden scaffold and a stout post, a place where, on certain days, punishments are carried out in public view. Today, however, the square is empty and still. In this gentle dawn light, everything looks peaceful, and it's hard to imagine the violence that sometimes unfolds here. As you observe this medieval scene in your mind's eye, let me introduce you to the figure we'll be following quietly tonight: the town's executioner. He is not yet in the square this morning. Perhaps he is waking up in his home on the outskirts of town. We will meet him properly soon, but first, consider why such a role even exists. In the medieval era, law and order could be harsh and uncompromising. Serious crimes like murder, arson, or treason were often punishable by death, and lesser crimes by painful penalties. Society believed that stern punishment was necessary to maintain peace and discourage others from wrongdoing. This meant that almost every community, from big cities to small towns, at one time or another needed someone to carry out the sentences of the court, someone to perform executions and other punishments on the condemned. That someone was the executioner. In the earliest part of the medieval period, long before our executioner ever picked up an axe or sword, the task of carrying out a death sentence wasn't always given to a single designated person. In very old times, justice could be personal. For example, if someone committed a terrible crime, the family of the victim or the local lord might take it upon themselves to exact revenge or punishment. There weren't formal executioners roaming around in the dark ages of early medieval society. The idea of a specialized official executioner developed slowly. As populations grew and towns formed, and as kings and councils made more complex laws, the need arose for an impartial person to enforce the ultimate punishments. You can imagine that at first, this duty might fall to whichever unlucky soul was ordered to do it, perhaps a soldier or a jailer, or even at times the victim's own family member, depending on local customs. But as the years went on, medieval society started to recognize the benefit of having a trained hand to carry out executions swiftly and efficiently, according to the law. This way, justice would be served in a controlled manner, supposedly for the public good, rather than through blood feuds or chaotic revenge. And so, gradually the role of the executioner became established as a public duty, albeit a dreaded and often hated one. And so the society recognized a person who was a public duty and not just a public failure. Now let's return to that small medieval town in our imagination. Picture the outskirts of the town, near the old city gates or just outside the walls. There, a modest little house stands apart from the others. It might be a simple cottage with wattle and daub walls and a thatched roof that has seen better days. A small curl of smoke rises from the chimney into the morning air. This is where the executioner lives. Unlike most townsfolk who reside in the bustling center or along market streets, our executioner's home lies in a quiet area. A bit removed, it has to be, because most neighbors don't want to live too close to him. Inside, the executioner is starting his day. He moves slowly and quietly, accustomed to solitude. Perhaps he puts on a pot of porridge over the hearth and splashes some cold water on his face from a basin. He knows he must tend to several duties today, but he also knows he likely will not be welcomed wherever he goes. Imagine him stepping outside as the sun climbs a little higher, illuminating the dewy grass. If you saw him, he might not look so different from a regular craftsman or laborer. Forget the image of a hooded figure dressed in all black. That's mostly a myth and exaggeration from later stories. In reality, a medieval executioner dressed like an ordinary man of his time, in a simple tunic and trousers, maybe an apron of leather if his work was likely to be messy. His face is not masked. Everyone in town knows who he is. There's no need for a hood, because his identity isn't a secret. In fact, it can't be a secret. Part of his burden is that everyone recognizes him, and many people fear or shun him on sight. As he walks toward the town square to check in with the authorities or to see if any sentences are scheduled, notice how the few villagers on the road react. A baker opening his shop might glance up, see the executioner in the distance, and then quickly look away as if pretending not to notice him. A mother ushering her children along might pull them closer, whispering a prayer under her breath as the executioner passes by, as though an evil spirit were near. Our executioner likely keeps his eyes downcast. He is used to these reactions. Being avoided is normal for him. He understands why, in their eyes, he is the hand of death, a necessary but unsettling presence. It still might sting a little every now and then to be treated like a walking curse, but he carries it quietly. Now consider how this man might have come into this grim line of work. Who on earth would choose to become an executioner, knowing it meant a lifetime of isolation and grisly tasks? The truth is, very few chose it willingly. In medieval times, the role was often bestowed upon someone against their own desires. Sometimes a person found themselves trapped in the profession by circumstance, family obligation, or outright coercion. There are few paths that led a person to this fate, none of them particularly happy. In many cases, the job was passed down from father to son, becoming an unwelcome family tradition. Imagine being born the child of an executioner. Your father might privately wish you could choose a different path, but he knows the world will almost certainly never let you escape the family trade. From your earliest days, other children might not play with you because of what your father does. You grow up on the margins of society, learning the craft of execution and punishment simply because it is your family's trade. Perhaps you don't want this life, but there are few ways out. Other guilds and trades won't accept the executioner's son as an apprentice. The blacksmiths, the merchants, the carpenters, they would all turn you away if you tried to pursue a normal occupation. So you watch your father maybe helping in small ways as you become a teenager, and you realize that one day the sword or rope will pass to you. This was the reality for many executioners, especially in later medieval times. It became a family profession, a grim legacy that one generation reluctantly handed to the next. In other instances, the role might be thrust upon someone as a form of punishment or by desperate necessity. There are accounts of criminals who were themselves sentenced to die, but were offered a fateful bargain. Their lives would be spared if they agreed to become the executioner. Imagine standing on the gallows with a noose around your neck, only to be told that you can walk free, but only if you pick up the noose and one day place it around someone else's neck. It was a cruel choice, swapping one doomed life for another. Some took the offer, unable to face their own death, yet there were also those who could not bring themselves to accept this grim bargain. Some condemned souls chose to proceed to the gallows rather than live on under the weight of such a duty, preferring to meet death on their own terms than assume the hated role. They might have stepped down, taken up the axe, and forever after be known as the person who carries out executions. One can only imagine the complicated feelings that would bring. There are also cases where an executioner was appointed almost randomly by a ruler who needed someone to fill the role. One day you could be an ordinary soldier or even a butcher by trade, and the next day you were told by the prince or lord that you are now the royal executioner. Refusing such an order was not really an option unless you wanted to face harsh consequences yourself. So you accept the duty, perhaps with dread in your heart. And from that moment on, you were marked as an executioner. In some places, they quite literally marked executioners so that everyone would never forget their position. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, for example, it's said that executioners might have an ear cut off as a sign of their role, a physical token of shame. So they stood out wherever they went. Elsewhere, an executioner might even be branded on the face with a hot iron by the authorities, essentially writing his grim job on his skin for life. It's a startling thought. The very people asked to enforce justice were themselves treated almost like criminals, disfigured and stigmatized from the start. So, whether by family inheritance, by coercion, or by a desperate bargain, a person became an executioner and stepped into a role that was both officially needed and socially reviled. Now, in our story, let's imagine that our executioner in the small town got into this profession because his father was an executioner before him. That is one of the most common scenarios. Perhaps years ago, his father had been a simple tradesman who somehow was roped into performing an execution, maybe as punishment for a misdeed or by the whim of a noble, and thereafter was forced to assume the position full time. Our executioner, as a boy, would have known from early on that his life was going to be very different from those of other children. Think of him as a young boy, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, accompanying his father quietly to the edge of town where the gallows stands. His father doesn't let him witness the worst parts, yet maybe he just has the boy help dig a grave for the poor soul who is about to be executed, or help steady a ladder. The boy sees enough to understand what his family does for a living. He sees the townsfolk gathered, the tense hush before his father does his duty. He might peek around a corner and watch as his father, with shaking hands, ties the noose or lifts the sword. Perhaps the boy squeezes his eyes shut at the final moment. It is a hard education, but it is the only one he knows. Over time, the boy learns from his father the various skills an executioner needs. This could include a grim apprenticeship in how to tie proper knots for hanging, how to sharpen a sword to a razor edge, or where to strike a blow to take a life swiftly. They might practice in secret, away from prying eyes, swinging the sword at straw targets or chopping melons or pumpkins to simulate the human body. In one famous account from the 1500s, a young executioner in training began by decapitating pumpkins set on a fence. Then he graduated to swinging at a live stray dog as a final test of his nerve, all before ever facing a human prisoner. It was brutal, but the aim was to make sure that when the time came, the executioner could do his job in one clean stroke, or with the proper technique, minimizing the suffering of the condemned and also minimizing the horror for onlookers. This brings us to an important point. As terrible as the executioner's tasks were, medieval societies expected them to be carried out with a certain level of skill and even mercy. A botched execution, say a headsman needing multiple blows to sever a head, or a hangman who mistied the knot so the victim strangles slowly rather than dying instantly, was seen as a great misfortune and even as an act of cruelty or incompetence. If an executioner failed to deliver a quick, clean death, the crowd might become enraged or deeply upset. As we noted, if they missed or only wounded the person, it became a horrid scene. The job then turned into butchery, with the poor victim suffering multiple blows and the watching crowd liable to grow angry or sickened. The historical record provides grim examples of such failures. In one notorious case, an inexperienced executioner in Tudor England needed an appalling 11 strokes of the blade to decapitate an elderly noblewoman, horrifying the spectators and staining that executioner's name for centuries. There are also accounts of enraged mobs rioting or even attacking an executioner who bungled an execution. So intense was the crowd's fury at witnessing prolonged suffering. Executioners themselves were keenly aware of these risks. Among their ranks, they whispered cautionary tales of the colleague who drank too much to calm his nerves and caused a bloody fiasco on the scaffold, or of the time an executioner's wife reportedly had to step forward and finish an execution when her husband faltered. Such stories, whether true or embellished, reminded every executioner of the fine line between a clean execution and disaster. There was clearly a powerful incentive to execute as cleanly as possible, and that meant having a relatively good understanding of the human body. Contrary to the crude popular stereotype, executioners weren't uneducated brutes. In fact, those in the profession often had uncommonly high literacy rates for members of their social class, along with fundamental knowledge of human anatomy and practical medicine, and thereby allowed them to have a much level of unconstantiable knowledge. Of course, they were an unconstantio profession, and of course for them, a successful executioner was expected to be precise and efficient at every execution. If he failed, he was accused not only of incompetence, but also of cruelty. In some regions, an executioner might be limited by law or custom to a certain number of strokes for a beheading, say, no more than 3 swings of the sword, and if a grisly scene resulted from 1 too many swings of the axe or blade, there could be serious consequences for him. Sometimes an unsuccessful executioner was attacked by furious spectators on the spot, and if he survived the crowd's wrath, the authorities might punish him afterward by withholding his fee, with imprisonment, or even by dismissing him from his office. Imagine the pressure on our executioner's shoulders when he stands on the scaffold in front of a crowd. He has one chance to make it as swift and smooth as possible. The condemned person's family might be watching, the town officials are certainly watching, and a large crowd of curious or morbid onlookers has gathered at the edges of the square or on a hillside beyond the town gate to witness the event. The executioner must keep a steady hand and a cool head in this intense moment. In the silence before the act, he can probably hear his own heartbeat. Perhaps he whispers a prayer, not unlike the condemned might be doing with the priest beside them. Perhaps earlier that morning he took a small draught of wine or ale to steady his nerves, a common practice among executioners before a critical moment. But he must be careful. Too much drink could make his hand unsteady, a risk he cannot afford. The magistrate, or whoever is in charge, reads out the sentence. The condemned is given a chance to speak or pray one final time. The executioner, weapon in hand, stands ready. He might have taken up a position just behind and to the side of the prisoner for a beheading, or off to the side for a hanging. He might flex his grip on the axe handle or test the tension of the rope one last time. He knows all eyes are on him, and he must not fail. It's interesting to note that in some cases, executioners sought a kind of ritual to ease their conscience and the prisoner's fear. One tradition in certain times and places was for the executioner to ask forgiveness from the person about to die. The executioner might quietly kneel or bow to the prisoner and ask for pardon, essentially saying, "I am only doing this because it is my duty." Sometimes the condemned about to meet their end would actually forgive the executioner and perhaps even give him a token. Historically, some noble prisoners would give a small coin to the executioner as a sign that they forgave him and as an incentive to do the job swiftly and well. It was a final act of grace, the person about to die absolving the one who must kill them. This kind of exchange was meant to help both parties. The prisoner could feel they had shown mercy at the end, and the executioner could take a tiny bit of comfort that he was not personally hated by the one he was about to execute. Now, let's talk a bit about the kinds of punishments and executions our medieval executioner might have to carry out. It was not all just hanging people or cutting off heads, though those were common. The exact methods of execution and torture varied from region to region, and they evolved over the medieval period. We will mention some of them, but we'll do so carefully and matter-of-factly, remembering we are just distant observers, hearing about these things from a quiet vantage point. Our goal is not to shock, but to understand what this job entailed. One of the most common methods of execution in medieval Europe was hanging. Hanging by the neck from the gallows was typically the fate for murderers, robbers, and many other common criminals, especially those of lower social status. It was considered a dishonorable death, and it was also relatively straightforward for an executioner to carry out. Often it took less specialized skill than other methods, though there was certainly technique involved. The executioner would lead the condemned up a ladder or onto a cart beneath a sturdy wooden gallows beam. He'd secure their hands, place a noose of coarse rope around their neck, tightening the knot just so under the ear. A properly placed knot would break the neck quickly when the person dropped. Then either the cart would be driven away, leaving the person hanging, or the executioner might remove a support or kick away a stool. Death, in the best case, would come in moments from a broken neck. In less ideal cases, the person might slowly strangle, legs kicking for a minute or two while the crowd watched in somber silence or murmuring pity. The executioner sometimes might even lend his own weight, pulling down on the person's legs to hasten their end and spare them a prolonged agony. It was a grim task, but considered a relatively standard form of execution in that time. Another method, reserved often for those of higher status or for certain serious crimes, was beheading. To be beheaded by a sword or axe was sometimes seen as more dignified or merciful because it could, if done right, be very swift. Nobles who were sentenced to death would typically demand or be granted beheading, as they deemed hanging fit only for common criminals. Our executioner, therefore, might at times have to perform a beheading on a raised scaffold in the town square or in a castle courtyard. This required a strong arm and precise aim. If he used a sword, as was common in Germanic regions and parts of Italy, the condemned would often be asked to kneel or sit upright, sometimes blindfolded or with their head positioned forward. The executioner would then swing the sword in a clean arc to sever the head in one blow. If an axe was the tool, more common in England and France for noble executions, usually a wooden block was provided, on which the prisoner laid their neck face down, and the executioner would raise the heavy axe and let it fall with deadly force. For a practiced executioner, one blow usually sufficed. They trained and prayed for that efficiency. But as we noted, if they missed or only wounded the person, it became a horrid scene. The job then turned into butchery, with the poor victim terribly injured and suffering, while the executioner had to swing again and again. The crowd's reaction in such cases could be volatile, as we described, and the executioner's own life could be imperiled from the outraged onlookers. There were other, more gruesome execution methods too, though these were not everyday occurrences. The medieval world could be unimaginably cruel to those it condemned as the worst offenders. If our executioner served long enough, he might be called upon to carry out some of these punishments as well, each with its own dreadful procedure. For example, consider the act of burning at the stake. This was a punishment often reserved for crimes seen as spiritually evil or threatening: heresy, holding beliefs condemned by the church, witchcraft, or sometimes certain kinds of moral crime. In such cases, the executioner's role would be to secure the victim to a large wooden stake in an open public area, often piling wood and straw around their feet, and then, at the appointed time, light the pyre. As terrible as this method was, even here, a merciful executioner might find ways to shorten the suffering. Some skilled executioners would tie a bag of gunpowder around the victim's neck or under their clothes, so that when the flames reached it, it would explode and kill the person quickly, rather than letting them burn slowly. Others might have quietly strangled or otherwise dispatched the person first, before the flames really took hold, especially if they felt pity or were bribed by the family to give a quicker end. Officially, they weren't supposed to interfere with the prescribed punishment, but the humanity of the executioner sometimes intervened in subtle ways. Another notorious punishment that an executioner might have to administer was called breaking on the wheel. This was considered one of the most brutal ways to execute someone, and was usually saved for the very worst criminals, such as bandit leaders or perpetrators of especially heinous murders. In this method, the condemned would be lashed down on the ground or on a flat wooden platform, and the executioner would use a heavy wagon wheel or sometimes an iron bar to systematically break the person's bones. Typically, the limbs were broken first. Often the executioner would smash the arms and legs at multiple points, shattering the bones. Then the shattered limbs might even be woven through the spokes of a large wheel, and the broken body hoisted up on that wheel for display, left to die slowly over many long hours or even days. It is an awful thing to picture. If there was some ounce of compassion allowed, the executioner might give what was called the coup de grace, the blow of mercy, usually a final swing to break the victim's neck or a heavy strike to the chest to rupture the heart, ending the prisoner's life more swiftly after the ritual of breaking. As distasteful as it is to talk about, this was part of the reality of medieval justice, and an executioner would have to harden himself to perform it when demanded. There were even more extreme punishments on the books, though thankfully they were rare. For the crime of high treason in medieval England, for example, the condemned might suffer the full, terrible sentence of drawing and quartering. In that process, the executioner first dragged the prisoner to the execution site on a hurdle or sled. Then the person was hanged, almost to the point of death, but cut down while still alive. Next came disembowelment. The executioner would cut open the abdomen and, believe it or not, pull out and burn the entrails while the victim yet lived. Finally, the executioner would behead the person and chop the body into 4 parts, quartered it, which were often displayed in different places as a warning. Describing this makes one shudder, and indeed, even in the Middle Ages, such an extreme penalty was reserved for only the most vilified traders. Our executioner might never perform such a procedure. Many executioners might go their whole careers without ever doing something so elaborate, but is part of the grim repertoire of the era's justice. Sometimes the punishment was not death, but mutilation, literally cutting off a part of the body as a penalty. An executioner in the Middle Ages often served as the enactor of these sentences too. For example, a thief might have a hand cut off as punishment, or a coin forger might be mutilated, or someone guilty of poaching might lose their fingers. The executioner would be tasked with cleanly amputating the specified body part. This required a surgical precision and a strong stomach, because the goal was to punish without killing. After the cut, the executioner would usually cauterize the wound with a hot iron or boiling oil to stop the bleeding and, incidentally, to inflict additional pain as part of the punishment. Similarly, criminals might be branded on the cheek or forehead with a mark of shame. And again, it was the executioner who heated the iron and pressed it to flesh. These acts blurred the line between punishment and crude medical procedure, and our executioner had to perform them with as much care as possible, paradoxically keeping the criminal alive while maiming them. Through all these grim duties, you might be wondering about the executioner's inner life. How did he cope with regularly dealing out death and torture, and then being treated as a pariah by everyone around him? The emotional and spiritual toll must have been immense. We can only piece together hints of it through historical records and a bit of empathetic imagination. Executioners were in a strange position. On the one hand, they grew somewhat desensitized to violence out of necessity. Handling blood and pain became a grim routine. But on the other hand, many were deeply aware of the moral weight of what they did. Some believed they were enacting God's justice or the rightful punishment ordered by their Lord, and this belief might have offered some comfort or justification. Yet in the dead of night, when an executioner was alone with his thoughts, one imagines that doubts and sorrows could creep in. From diaries and letters that survive, we do know that some executioners felt pity and empathy for those they executed. Our earlier mention of the executioner's diary from Bavaria, the one who trained by chopping pumpkins, reveals that he often felt compassion. He recorded prayers for the souls of the people he had to execute. He tried to give them dignified deaths, and he took no joy in their suffering. In fact, he viewed himself as a caretaker of justice, and even, in some moments, a kind of reluctant guardian of the condemned in their final hours, ensuring their end was as humane as possible, given the circumstances. He also noted that if he had had a choice, he might rather have been a doctor using his knowledge of the body to heal instead of to harm. That particular executioner, after a long career, actually did petition the authorities to allow his children to pursue other professions, to break the cycle so that they wouldn't have to follow in his footsteps. In a small triumph, he succeeded. His family was released from the hereditary curse of the executioner's office, and his children could become whatever they wished, free at last from the shadow that had covered him. These glimpses show us that executioners were not all cruel, heartless villains. They were human beings stuck in a job that very few could tolerate, doing it because someone had to, and often because fate cornered them into it. They had to reconcile the violence they delivered with whatever sense of morality or religion they held. It is no wonder that many executioners were very concerned with religion. They, more than anyone, dealt daily in life and death, and the question of sin and redemption. Ironically, while they served the cause of justice, and often did so under the watchful eye of the church, especially in cases of heresy or sacrilege, the church itself was uneasy about them. Executioners in many places were forbidden from fully participating in church life, treated almost as if they were spiritually unclean. People didn't want to stand next to them in the pews. Many executioners were not allowed to take communion in the local church during Mass. If they were allowed to attend, they might be made to stand in a corner in the back, apart from the rest of the congregation. Some churches refused to administer communion to executioners because of the blood on their hands, as if their very presence at the holy altar was a contamination. On a great holy day, such as Easter morning, he might stand just outside the church doors, listening to the choir and the prayers from within. He does not presume to take a seat among the faithful. Perhaps, if a compassionate priest so chooses, he will bring the executioner the Eucharist after Mass has ended, offering the sacrament in the porch so that the man need not enter and disturb the congregation. Or perhaps even that small inclusion is denied and the executioner simply bows his head and prays alone outside while the service goes on. Even in his faith, he remains at a remove, a participant in salvation only from the threshold. People wouldn't have invited an executioner into their homes for dinner or social visits either. Many executioners were barred from guilds and associations. They couldn't hold public office or positions of honor. Some schools would not even accept the children of executioners as students. Marriage for an executioner was often a private affair. Perhaps he could not be wed inside the church like others, so the ceremony might take place in his own living room or yard with only a priest and a few witnesses. When he died, he might be denied burial in consecrated ground. Instead of resting in the town churchyard with his neighbors, he could be interred in an unconsecrated corner beyond the cemetery or at the foot of the gallows where he had sent so many others. As an executioner, he lived with these social penalties every day. He would have had a lonely life. His house, as we noted, was situated outside the town. At the inn, he sat in a designated place and even had his own tankard to drink from to avoid polluting the common dishes. When the executioner entered a tavern's public room, he had to ask the permission of all those present before he could sit down. Often enough, upon such a request, some patrons would silently stand up and leave rather than share a table with him. Imagine the humility or humiliation of that routine. The Quisels, a famous executioner family in Bavaria, were not allowed to hold honorary office, to marry in a church, or to have their children baptized as Christians. A church burial was similarly denied them. Their profession, like that of the gravedigger, the prostitute, the itinerant carnival worker, the barber surgeon, the shepherd, the bailiff, and even the miller, was considered dishonorable. This meant that they were also unable to change professions, never mind being allowed to marry someone from a different guild. This was among the reasons that executioner dynasties like the Quisels became so long-learning. They had no choice but to continue the trade within the family generation after generation. Perhaps at night he hears one of his children sobbing softly, hurt by the taunts or avoidance they experienced that day. He sits by their bedside and tries to comfort them. His young daughter might ask in a trembling voice, "Papa, why won't the other children play with me?" The executioner has no easy answer. He strokes her hair and whispers a gentle reassurance. They just don't know you well, my love. You are a good girl. One day they will see that. He hopes his words will be true. He wraps her in a warm hug and tucks the blanket around her. As he blows out the candle, he silently curses a world that places this burden on an innocent child. In the darkness, he promises himself that he will endure anything if it means his children might have a chance at a better life. This social isolation meant that executioners were left to consort with others, forced to occupy society's underworld, undesirables, such as vagrants, beggars, prostitutes, and lepers. Executioners often ended up socializing only with people who themselves were shunned by polite society. That only boosted public suspicion of executioners and their families, creating a vicious cycle. The executioner was shunned because he consorted with outcasts, and he consorted with outcasts because he was shunned. Executioners, therefore, were a conundrum, crucial for maintaining law and order, yet shunned because of their unsavory work. Attitudes toward professional executioners were highly ambiguous. They were considered both necessary and impure at the same time. People feared them and needed them, despised them and depended on them. Yet, there were a few professional perks to this morbid work. Executioners benefited from something called havage, a kind of tax or right that gave them the ability to take a portion of food and drink from market vendors for free. Essentially, when the executioner went to the market, he could help himself to a bit of produce or a loaf of bread or a measure of ale without paying. This was permitted by town authorities as a way to provide for him, since many merchants would refuse to directly trade with an executioner out of fear or superstition. What's more, the authorities usually gave the executioner free lodging, often letting him live in a house right by the city walls, and released him from paying tolls and taxes. These small allowances were intended to compensate for the executioner's social isolation, and frankly, to compel him to stay in the job. After all, if he could not survive or feed his family, he might abandon the position, and then the town would have no one to do the unpleasant work of justice. Executioners were also sometimes allowed to keep certain byproducts of their work, which could turn a profit. For example, when he executed someone by hanging, he typically could claim the clothes and personal possessions that the criminal had on them at the time of death. Those garments might be resold, quietly perhaps to poorer folks or second-hand dealers, or used by the executioner's own family. If he needed to dispose of an animal carcass, part of his extra duties, as we'll discuss, he might have the right to flay the hide and keep it, selling the leather or bones to tanners or chandlers. These little side benefits helped supplement the executioner's income, which, given how infrequent executions might be, was often not enough by itself to live on. Executioners were typically paid per task, a certain fee for an execution, another fee for an amputation, etc. Unless they were on a fixed salary, which some larger cities provided. The pay was actually not bad compared to many other laborers, precisely because of how undesirable the work was. For instance, records from medieval England suggest an executioner could earn several shillings for a single execution, which might equal weeks of wages for a normal craftsman. By the late medieval period, some executioners in prosperous cities were comparatively well off financially, though no amount of money could buy them acceptance in society. But in smaller towns, the work was irregular and the pay modest, so the executioner often had to scramble with odd jobs and privileges to make ends meet. In fact, much of an executioner's working life was spent on things other than executions. Town authorities regularly assigned him the most unpleasant odd jobs that others would not touch. He might be summoned to clear a block cesspit or clean the foul-smelling public latrines. If a horse collapsed and died in the street, it was the executioner who had to drag the carcass away and dispose of it, though as a small benefit, he could claim the animal's hide and bones to sell or use. Should packs of stray dogs become a nuisance, the executioner would be tasked with culling them. He was also the one who dealt with people society wanted to keep at arm's length. For example, he might be responsible for escorting lepers outside the town gates, or driving away persistent vagrants and beggars, In larger towns, he could even be asked to oversee the orderly running of the brothels or the gambling dens, making sure that these illicit businesses paid their dues and kept to certain rules. For the town council, it seemed logical to hand all these dirty tasks to the man already stigmatized by his role. And for the executioner, these additional duties and the fees or stipends they brought were essential to make a living, especially in the long stretches when no executions took place. In some places, the executioner was even granted a few small privileges to help offset his social burdens. For instance, he might be allowed to take a portion of food or drink for free from market vendors, a practice called the executioner's share, or havage, since many merchants would not want to directly trade with him. The town authorities often provided him with basic lodging, usually a modest house by the town wall, and exempted him from paying local taxes or tolls. These little allowances did not make him wealthy, but they ensured he could survive. They were intended as modest compensation for the hardships of his role and as an incentive for him to continue in a job that few would willingly do. Our executioner's role placed him in an uneasy social position. He was both feared and needed, reviled and yet called upon whenever the community demanded justice. Let us consider how his situation might differ or resemble others in various parts of medieval Europe. They kept the living. In France, for example, by the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, the profession of executioner became quite formalized and even hereditary. The French monarchy and courts appointed official executioners in major cities, positions that came with titles and sometimes a macabre sort of prestige. Paris, the capital, had a chief executioner who carried out high-profile executions and oversaw others. And families like the Sanson family, who rose to prominence a bit later in the 17th and 18th centuries, are famous for being hereditary executioners serving the French state for generations. Even during medieval times, French executioners might have a coat of arms or an official uniform provided by the authorities. They were, after all, recognized as officers of justice. Yet, despite the royal sanction, socially they were still ostracized. People would refer to the executioner euphemistically as Monsieur de Paris in later centuries, or call the executioner's sword the sword of justice. But nobody wanted to shake the executioner's hand or encounter him on the street. French executioners and their families lived in a sort of bubble, feared by the populace and occasionally even used as bogeymen to scare children. Be good, or the executioner will get you. Bravio. And a mother might warn a naughty child, but never fully accepted into normal society. In the Holy Roman Empire, the patchwork of German-speaking regions in Central Europe, the executioner, often called the Scharfrichter, which means sharp judge, had a similar story of stigma. Early on, before the 13th century, most small communities didn't have a specialized executioner. Executions were done by whomever had to do it, like the local constable or even the victims' families. But as medieval towns grew larger and obtained from their rulers the right of high justice, the authority to execute criminals, they increasingly hired professional executioners. German executioners, as we learned, often had to supplement their income with many side jobs. One city's council might say to the executioner, "We will pay you a small retainer each year plus a fee per execution. In between, you are expected to also be the knacker, that is to collect dead animals from the streets, dispose of carcasses, clean the sewage pits, and maybe take care of moving diseased or undesirable people out of town, like shooing away lepers or rounding up vagrants." It was all the dirty work rolled into one position. For this reason, Germans had a term unehrliche Leute, meaning dishonorable people, and executioners were included in that category alongside those other unsavory but needed occupations. By the late medieval and into the early modern period, trade guilds and honorable professions absolutely refused to associate with executioners or their families. An executioner couldn't join the guild of coopers or bakers, for example, and he couldn't marry a guildsman's daughter without special permission, which was rarely granted. An executioner of Nuremberg named Master Jorg in the 16th century actually managed to gain enough respect to be granted citizenship and even an honorary office, the ceremonial title of wooden kaifmaker, when he retired. A very rare gesture of acceptance. and a few years later, another long-serving executioner from that same city had his honor restored by the emperor himself, freeing the executioner's children from the stigma so they could pursue other careers. These are exceptional cases that prove the rule. Normally, executioners in German lands bore that stain of dishonor all their lives, unless some extraordinary act pardoned or elevated them. In England and Scotland, the situation was a bit different in the medieval period. Executioners did exist, of course. Someone had to hang criminals or behead traitors when required, but the position was often more ad hoc or informal outside of big cities. In smaller towns and villages in medieval England, carrying out an execution might fall to the local sheriff or his assistant, rather than a specialized hangman. Only in larger towns or cities would there be a person known primarily as the hangman or headsman. By the late Middle Ages, the 15th century, and certainly into Tudor times, 16th century, London had an official executioner for its frequent public executions, and important cases like the beheadings of noble figures saw dedicated executioners brought in. But interestingly, English executioners in later centuries, especially 18th, 20th centuries, weren't as uniformly shunned as their continental counterparts. They were still not well loved socially, but some became somewhat respected and even famous for their skill. That's beyond the medieval period, though. In medieval times, we know far fewer names of English executioners. They remain mostly shadows in the records, which suggests that many were not part of long family dynasties, but rather were hired men, sometimes even drawn from the ranks of criminals themselves as needed. A story from medieval Scotland illustrates how the role could be filled. At one point, the city of Aberdeen had no executioner, so they looked among the prisoners. They offered a condemned man his life in exchange for taking up the axe. He accepted, did the job, and thus became the town's hangman. It's a scenario that likely played out in various places. If no one volunteered for the position, they'd effectively say, well, here's a man headed for the noose, perhaps he'd prefer employment. Italy, during medieval and Renaissance times, also employed executioners who held a similarly low social status. The Italian city-states often favored methods like beheading with a sword for executing nobles or hanging for others. In Rome, under the Papal States, the executioner, later famously called Mastro Tita in the 19th century, was a needed figure for the many executions carried out by both the Inquisition and the secular courts. But like elsewhere, he lived apart from ordinary society. In Florence, there's a documented case where a foreigner, a German man, who had been sentenced to death, was instead spared on the condition that he served the city as an executioner. Being an outsider perhaps made it easier for everyone. He had no local family to shame and no local ties. As long as he did the job, the city did not care that he was not one of their own. In fact, it might have been preferable to have a stranger bear the stigma rather than a local man. From Spain to Scandinavia, across Europe, you'd find that theme. Executioners often came from outside or from marginal backgrounds, or else they formed their own isolated family lines over generations. It hardly mattered if the country was Catholic or Protestant, the attitude remained the same. Executioners were considered necessary, but were never embraced as normal members of the community. This paradox of the shunned executioner was not unique to you. Throughout the world, many cultures developed a similar pattern of treating their executioners as social outcasts. In Korea, for instance, the hereditary executioners were part of a caste known as the Baekjeong, an untouchable class that also handled butchery and other unclean trades. They were despised by the rest of society, much as their European counterparts were. In Japan, too, executioners historically belonged to the marginalized Burokumin community and suffered severe discrimination. Even in places where the executioner's role was tied to the ruling elite, the stigma persisted. The Ottoman Empire, for example, entrusted most executions to a special corps of the Sultan's guards rather than to common citizens. Yet even these official executioners had their own separate graveyard in Istanbul, their tombstones left uncarved and plain, as if to avoid honoring the men who carried out the state's deadly deed. Across cultures and continents, it seems people have long struggled with the uncomfortable necessity of executioners, often responding by separating them as much as possible from ordinary society. Let's go back to our executioner as he prepares for another day in his small town. Suppose that tomorrow an execution is scheduled. A thief who murdered a traveler on the road is to be hanged in the morning. How does the executioner spend the night before? Perhaps he cannot sleep deeply, even though he has done this dozens of times. There's always a tension before an execution. He checks his ropes carefully by lamplight, making sure there are no frays or weak spots that could cause the rope to snap. He might rub his hands, calloused and scarred, and think quietly about the task ahead. If he's a religious man, he might kneel and pray, not necessarily asking forgiveness, for he might firmly believe he's just an instrument of justice, not a murderer, but possibly asking for the strength to do the job well, or praying for the soul of the condemned and for God's mercy on them both. At dawn, he'll go to the jail and collect the prisoner. He's done this many times, walking the last walk with the condemned from the dim cell to the gallows outside town. Often a priest will be present, murmuring prayers and giving spiritual comfort to the prisoner as they walk. The executioner stands a pace behind, holding the rope coiled in his hand, or perhaps the prisoner is already bound. Some prisoners are crying, some are numb and pale, some are defiantly shouting their innocence or cursing fate. The executioner has seen all sorts of reactions. In a way, he becomes a silent confidant to these souls in their final minutes. Occasionally, a prisoner might turn to him and ask in a trembling voice, "Will it hurt?" or beg him, "Please make it quick." He usually answers gently, maybe with a quiet nod or a soft word. He doesn't want to torment them any further. If allowed, he might promise them, "I'll do it in one swing," or "It will be quick." Little assurances that could ease their fear of fraction. In the town square, villagers gather because an execution is grim entertainment as well as a public lesson. Parents might bring older children to show them what happens to evildoers. It's like a living morality play. Do evil and see how you'll end up. But it's also a cautionary ritual meant to reinforce the law and order of the community. The executioner leads the prisoner up onto the cart beneath the gallows. The sheriff or a magistrate reads out the crime and the sentence one last time for all to hear. The crowd rustles. Some people shout insults at the condemned if his crime was particularly heinous and rouse their anger. The condemned maybe tries to speak. Often they were allowed a final word to confess and ask forgiveness, and it was expected that they would die having expressed remorse. To meet God with a penitent heart, the executioner stands by quietly during this. The center of all eyes, yet in a sense invisible. People are focusing on the drama of the criminal's last moments, not on him, though they certainly will focus on him if he errs. When the moment comes, the executioner does his duty. For a hanging, he might take a hood, if one is used, and slip it over the prisoner's head, covering their face and giving them the small mercy of not seeing the noose swinging in front of them. He places the rope around the neck, positioning the knot under the left ear, just as he was taught, ensuring that the drop will break the neck cleanly. He double-checks everything swiftly. His hands are steady from long practice. The magistrate gives a signal, or perhaps the condemned finishes a final prayer. The executioner then performs the last act. Maybe he slaps the horse to drive the cart out from under the person's feet, or he kicks away the stool supporting them. The prisoner's body drops and jerks to a stop as the rope snaps taut. With luck, there's an instant, almost soundless break of the neck, and the body goes limp, swinging slightly. The crowd perhaps collectively exhales, a mixture of relief and awe. The executioner remains for a moment listening to be sure there are no breath sounds, confirming that the neck indeed broke. If the person is struggling in a poorly executed hanging, he might grasp their legs and pull downward to hasten death, or he may have to simply wait grimly until it's over. Let's assume our executioner is skilled and it goes quickly. After a short while, maybe the town bell tolls to signal that justice has been carried out, the deed is done. The relatives, if any, of the deceased might come forward to ask for the body, to give it a proper burial. Otherwise, the executioner will cut the corpse down, and if it's an infamous criminal, perhaps the authorities will have the body displayed or gibbeted for some time as a warning. or just buried quietly near the gallows fields. Handling the corpse respectfully, or not, could also be part of his work. Sometimes he had to dig a grave right there and inter the criminal in unconsecrated ground by the gallows. The crowd disperses with a mix of relief, solemn reflection, and perhaps a bit of morbid satisfaction that justice was done. But do they applaud the executioner? Do they thank him for ridding them of a murderer? No, usually not. He might get a brief nod from the sheriff, or the agreed upon fee might be handed to him by a clerk, but townsfolk mostly avoid him, as usual. Only those who absolutely must approach him do so, say to retrieve the body of their loved one. And even then, they do it with fear and loathing in their eyes. To the public, he is still an ominous figure. By sundown, life in town goes back to normal, as if nothing extraordinary happened that day, except that one less soul lives among them. The executioner, meanwhile, returns to his lonely cottage outside the walls, payment in hand for this job, and waits to be summoned the next time he's needed. As medieval society moved toward the end of that era in the 15th and 16th centuries, some things began to change. The frequency of brutal public tortures and executions reached a peak during times of social stress, such as witch hunts or during civil wars and uprisings. But in some places, a sense of emerging enlightenment was budding that would eventually question these practices. However, for many generations more, executioners remained busy and remained pariahs. It wasn't really until the 1700s and 1800s that Europe saw significant shifts in the philosophy of punishment. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about crime and punishment, the notion that perhaps punishment shouldn't be about spectacle and terror as much as about correction, or at least a more measured justice. Over time, some countries reduced the number of offences that carried the death penalty, and some outlawed judicial torture entirely. Public executions, while still common in the 1700s, started to be seen by some thinkers as crude and chaotic events that might do more harm than good, morally. By the 19th century, several places moved executions away from the public square and into the more private space of prison yards, making them less of a carnival-like spectacle. What did this mean for executioners? In some cases, their social standing improved a little when their role became less public and sensational. In England, for instance, the Victorian-era hangmen were sometimes even proud of their professional technique and were known figures, though they still often kept low profiles in private life. In France, the Revolution famously introduced the guillotine, a new humane device for execution, and the office of state executioner, which continued well into the 20th century for a time, gained an almost clinical respect as a necessary functionary of justice. Yet even the last French executioners in the 1900s kept their identities semi-private or tried to live ordinary lives outside their grim work to avoid the lingering stigma. But back in medieval times, none of those reforms had occurred yet. Our executioner and his peers across the lands had to endure many long years of being needed but never truly accepted. There is a certain tragic dignity to them when we look back now. These were people who, through some twist of fate, held the job of doing society's dirtiest work. They likely had to build emotional walls around themselves, perhaps finding camaraderie only with fellow outcasts or within their own family circle. They were men, and in very rare cases women. There is a legend in Ireland of an infamous female executioner who stepped in to hang prisoners when the male hangman fell ill, who lived in the shadows of their communities. Think for a moment of the executioner's daily life beyond the executions. On an ordinary day when no punishments were scheduled, he might wake up and tend to chores like any other person. Maybe he keeps a small vegetable garden behind his house, since he can't always rely on the market for food. Some vendors might not even sell to him. After all, maybe he has a goat or a cow for milk. He would do repairs around his house, patching a leak in the roof or chopping wood for the fire. But even doing those simple tasks, he knows he can't just stroll into the tavern at midday to have an ale among the craftsmen on their lunch break. If he wants a drink, some taverns might only serve him in a special mug kept just for him, so that no one else has to drink from the same cup as the executioner. One account tells of an executioner who had his own tankard at an inn, hanging on a hook, and he sat at a designated table apart from the others. If he ever wanted to join the main common room, he had to politely ask if everyone present was okay with it, at which point, predictably, some would object or quietly slip out. Imagine the lonely humility of that routine. When he or his family needed new clothes, likely a tailor would come take measurements at their home rather than have them come into a busy shop. Or they wore hand-me-downs and homespun garments, because tailors might also refuse to serve them. The executioner's coin might be considered ill-gotten or cursed by some merchants. Though money is money, and some would accept it discreetly, in many towns the executioner wasn't even permitted to enter certain guild-operated shops or to buy particular goods. Perhaps a butcher would sell to him, since butchers were low setties too, albeit not as low, but a pastry seller might not. He and his family had to live with these inconveniences daily, yet for all these hardships, executioners did form an indispensable part of the justice system of their time. They were often more intimately knowledgeable about the criminal underworld than the authorities themselves. Forced to consort with undesirables, as we mentioned, they might hear gossip from thieves or prostitutes. They sometimes acted as a go-between for the authorities and the underclasses. In a way, the executioner inhabited both worlds. He dealt regularly with judges and nobles who commanded him to enforce the laws, and he also moved among the fringe folk, the outcasts and lawbreakers, because those were the only people who would socialize with him. This gave him a unique perspective, perhaps, on the very society that kept him at arm's length. We can imagine our executioner reflecting in some quiet moment that perhaps there isn't so much difference between him and any other man except for fate. On another path, he might have been a blacksmith, respected for making plows and horseshoes, able to walk freely into church and marketplace. But in this life, he happens to be the one who swings the sword of justice. Does he ever ask himself, why me? Maybe at times he does, in the dark of the night. But maybe he also finds a kind of purpose to cling to. Perhaps he tells himself, if not me, someone else would have to do it, and they might do it worse. Perhaps he takes a sober pride in performing his duties as humanely as possible, in offering a final prayer for the condemned, in upholding the law without personal malice. In some towns, executioners were even called upon to perform symbolic acts of justice beyond the actual execution. For example, they might be tasked with burning the effigy of a criminal who had died in custody or fled, or with publicly destroying the house of someone as a form of punishment by proxy. They were truly agents of the law, in various ways, not just executioners. Time goes on in our narrative. Years pass, our executioner grows older. Maybe his son is now a teenager, standing awkwardly at the foot of the gallows during an execution, learning the craft as his father once did. Perhaps the son feels differently about it. Maybe he doesn't want this life at all. Maybe one day he runs away to join a mercenary company or become a sailor, trying to escape the stigma of his family name. That did happen in some cases. There are stories of executioners' children attempting to start fresh elsewhere under a new identity, but carrying the physical marks of the trade, like a missing ear or a branded forehead, if those were used, made that nearly impossible in many instances. If the son does run, one day the town finds itself without an executioner. Then what? They might have to borrow one from the next town over. Executioners did sometimes travel a circuit serving multiple towns, or they'd try again the method of sparing a criminal's life in exchange for taking on the role. The wheel of fate turns and someone else gets ensnared in the old role. Alternatively, maybe the son dutifully accepts his fate and follows in his father's footsteps. The executioner father, wanting a slightly better life for his child, tries to educate him, at least in reading and writing. And we know that executioners often were more literate than one might assume, given their station. Some maintained detailed records of their work, diaries listing dates and names, like the one we mentioned earlier. Literacy might have been a practical necessity for them to read official warrants and correspondence, but it also indicates that they weren't simple brutes. Many had a thoughtful or meticulous side. Our executioner might own a Bible or a book of prayers and read it at night. He might keep a small journal where he jots down the names of those he has executed, perhaps as a way to remember and honor them in his own private manner. Eventually, if the political winds shift, or if he serves long and faithfully, our executioner might dare to petition the town council for a small mercy. Could they allow his daughter to marry a butcher's son, a modest but respectable match, for example? Would they let his family move into a house within the city walls for safety and a chance at normal neighborly relations instead of being relegated outside the gate? Perhaps occasionally such petitions were granted if the town was particularly grateful to the executioner, or if a new generation of officials was more enlightened. But mostly, one suspects, the answer was no. Prejudices in medieval society were deeply ingrained and often codified into local laws and guild rules. The executioner's lot was to remain separate. One more aspect remains to be considered: the executioner's relationship with the church. We've touched on this, but while the church generally kept executioners at arm's length, it also recognized the necessity of their work. The church, in medieval times, sanctioned capital punishment in many cases. For example, it handed over heretics to secular authorities for execution, since the church claimed it did not directly shed blood. Some priests or monks might have even seen ministering to the executioner as a charitable act, like tending to a leper, caring for someone burdened by a kind of perpetual sin, even if it was not personal sin so much as the sin inherent in their bloody work. Did executioners receive absolution for their deeds? Likely many sought it. Perhaps a confessor would give them special penances, extra prayers or alms to atone for each life taken, even though it was done lawfully. The executioner might cross himself every time he stepped off the scaffold, murmuring, "Lord, have mercy on me." For all we know, some executioners had nightmares or a guilty conscience, especially if they ever doubted the guilt of someone they executed. Indeed, there were times when executioners were forced to put to death people who went to their deaths protesting innocence, or during fervor-fueled witch trials where confessions were tortured out of suspects, the executioner himself might privately sense that a frightened old woman branded a witch was likely innocent, yet he had to carry out her sentence. Those cases must have weighed heavily on them. Our story of why it sucked to be a medieval executioner wouldn't be complete without highlighting just how paradoxical this role was. Imagine simultaneously being one of the most feared individuals in town and one of the most despised. People step aside in dread when you walk by, giving you a wide berth. They fear your very shadow, perhaps whispering that the executioner carries an aura of death that could bring bad luck. At the same time, they speak of you with contempt behind your back, as if you are cruel, vulgar, or perhaps touched by evil. In truth, maybe you are simply a quiet, somber man who takes no pleasure in his work, but hardly anyone cares to know the person behind the grim title. In public, you enforce their laws. In private, they would never invite you to a wedding feast or a holiday celebration. Even the beggar on the street might hesitate to accept a coin from your hand, worried it's tainted by blood. The local bathhouse, if the town has one, might not allow you to bathe with others. Your presence could literally clear out the water as other bathers hastily leave in disgust. That did happen in some recorded cases. Executioners were sometimes banned from public bathhouses or had specified hours when only they could use them. Given all this, one might wonder, did any executioners ever manage to break the mold and become accepted in their communities? There are indeed accounts, mostly from later centuries, of executioners who performed acts of bravery or kindness that made townsfolk see them in a slightly different light. Perhaps our executioner one day saves a child from drowning in the river, or he defends the town gates from bandits using the skill with weapons that he has honed. For a brief moment, people might thank him and treat him as a hero for his bravery, but usually when he returns to his usual work and the memory of the incident fades, the old stigma creeps back and he is once again kept at a distance. It is hard to erase such deep fear and superstition. As the medieval period waned and the early modern era dawned, some executioners did try to reinvent themselves or find a way out when forms of capital punishment became less public or more centralized. For example, when a country decided that all executions would happen only in the capital city, local executioners sometimes lost their jobs or had to find new work. Some executioners or their children became slaughterhouse workers or butchers, fields that, while still considered unclean by some, were more acceptable than execution and used similar skills. Others, remarkably, turned to medicine, taking that anatomical knowledge and steady hand and becoming surgeons or healers once given the chance. In one notable case after the medieval period, the descendants of a long line of executioners became respected physicians and artists once the family was able to leave the trade behind, proving that the stigma could indeed end and that they had talents far beyond the axe and rope. Finally, consider the last days of our aging executioner. If he served into older age, and many tried to, as it was their livelihood, he might develop tremors in his hands or stiff joints, not ideal for someone who must be precise. Eventually, he would have to retire or pass the duty to someone else, often a son, if available. Maybe he's given a small pension by the town, or maybe he relies on the savings and perks he accumulated. In his final years, does he finally get a bit of normal respect? Possibly the town folks who once feared him now hardly see him, as he stays quietly at home. When he falls ill, will a doctor come to treat him? Perhaps not. He or his family might have to treat him with the same home remedies he once used on others. And when he dies, how is he mourned? It could be a lonely burial at dusk, with maybe a priest saying a quick blessing from a distance and a few family members lowering him into the earth outside the normal graveyard walls. Perhaps a handful of curious townspeople watch from afar, half out of superstitious concern, as if to ensure the executioner is truly gone to his rest. But here's something to reflect on. Even after death, executioners sometimes had a strange place in local folklore. Some townsfolk might breathe a sigh of relief that the Grimnan is gone, yet stories about him might circulate for years, exaggerated tales of how many people he killed, or eerie ghost stories claiming that his restless spirit haunts the gallows hill where so many died. In a way, he becomes part of local legend, a figure half real and half myth, remembered with a shudder, but also acknowledged as a necessary part of their history, an essential cog in the old machinery of justice. Now, as you lie here listening, close your eyes and imagine the quiet that finally comes for our executioner. Imagine the town at midnight, long after an execution day. The gallows stands silhouetted against a pale moon. All is silent. Perhaps our executioner, now an old man, walks up the hill to that gallows when no one is around and sits for a moment under the scaffold, gazing at the stars and thinking of all that happened there. He might whisper a prayer for the departed souls and for his own. Then he walks home in the cool darkness, a solitary figure with only the moonlight as his companion. Close your eyes and imagine that scene, and be thankful that such burdens are no longer placed on anyone in most of the world today. The past is far away now. You are here, in your bed, safe and warm. Let the images of that harsh job fade into the gentle darkness of your room. As you drift off to sleep, carry this soft understanding with you. Even in harsh jobs and dark times, there were human stories, complicated, poignant, and real. The medieval executioner's life was undoubtedly a difficult one, filled with contradictions and sorrow, but it also reveals the resilience of those who carry heavy burdens for the sake of others. His story, quietly told, can now rest in peace in your mind. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. Sleep well, and good night.